Okay, so we're in the middle of the Maamar, actually towards the beginning of the Maamar. I don't know if we're going to be able to do a class tomorrow, so Mr. Rabbi finish the Maamar next week. Um, so let's bring up the text. Okay, so we're holding page 314, middle of Sif Bays. We're talking about the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu, who was Hashem answers Moshe, who says that I'm loved Varmanoiche, I can't speak, or else of a sign that Misam Pel Adam, who gives a man, who gives voice to man, who gives a mouth to man, and also the miracles that were made. Moshe was running away from Pharaoh, go on his way to Midian. It made people blind, deaf, dumb, and mute. So the question was, why do we have so many miracles? Why can we have it a single miracle? Why can Moshe be blind? Why was also the Moshe Rabbeinu's ability to speak was more miraculous than a simple miracle of just curing him? That either that he was able to have, just when he spoke to Pharaoh, he was able to be communicative, or that he was able to, that Pharaoh was able to understand him. Okay, so this is where we're holding basically the beer now. What does it mean? The difference between the way Hashem fills the world and the way Hashem encompasses the world. So he says, the Rebbe continues, is he a Kaddish, like we said, this idea of Kaddish Baruch Hu. Kaddish Baruch Hu, we said, was that Kaddish, which is Soiviv, is Baruch, comes down into Mimali, into to be Megat, to be in the way of Gilu. The Rebbe says the idea, he's in Kaddish, when we say Kaddish, Koya, Abichin Soiviv, that's referring to Soiviv. Kaddish means separate. So Soiviv is separate, can't come into the world like Mimali, the way Neshama fills the world. Hashem is Soiviv Kolam. Ve'ena kavanah etzem bechinas Soiviv kfi shehu muvdal gamri me'oilma is. We're not talking about the way Hashem is, the way it's totally separate from the world. Shari etzem bechinas Soiviv nikar Kaddish mile begarmei, because there's Kaddish with a vav and Kaddish which is with a cholam without the vav. The letter vav indicates that there's a connection. Vav is mamshech hashpa. So the Kaddish, although it's Kaddish, which is separate, but it's Kaddish with a vav, meaning to say that it has a connection to the world, but it's the way it's encompassing the world. Kaddish that's totally connected from the world is Kaddish without a vav, which is called Mili Begarmei. It's not Kaddish as it's a connection, Kaddish Baruch Hu. Ashenkin Kaddish Bevav, Harevav Mayra Alin Amshacha. The vav in the letter, again, it can be spelled with the cholim, with the nekudas, or it could be spelled with the letters. So if it's spelled with the letters, it's an indication of connection, which is the vav, which is Mayra Alin Amshacha, the way it comes down. And the Shamshacha, who B'derech Avdallah, its Amshacha is in the way of separation. Means you have that it's separate on its own, B'chlal, no connection, has absolutely no connection, or its connection is in a way of separation. It's the way the kav, which the kav is already coming from kav after already the timtum, but it's the kav, the line of hamshacha, the way it's beyond, separate from the world. I mean, it's not affected by the limitations of the world, like something which is soiviv kol alamim, like explains many places in Chassidus. The very fact that it says soiviv kol alamim, that soiviv the world, means that there's a connection to the world, but it's soiviv it. That's how we could go from Kaddish into Baruch, the Kav Bechinas Memali, because it's not totally separate from the world, but it has a Kav, but it's the way the Kav is separate, but then it comes down Mamshich into the world, into the Memali Kav. Hamshachas Kav Kotzir Mitzumsim Fi'er Choilnis, means the Kav itself, which is beyond the world, becomes more Mitzumsim, more contracted, so it could be fit into the world. What does this mean to people? Idea of Mimalik Olamim, or the way Soiviv Kolamim, the way it comes into Mimalik Olamim, believable. The idea of Soiviv Kolamim represents the concept of believable, the limitless. Also, from there is the marker of Nisim, of miracles. The Ein HaKavana al believable mamash. We're not talking about limitless mamash. Sharei Hamshacha Zuhi Mibichinas Kaddish Bevav, because it's still coming from Vav, which means that it has some connection to the world. If it was totally believable, it would be Kaddish without a vav. When we say Kaddish Baruch Hu with the vav, it's the limitless within limitations. What does that mean? Which is an idea that's brought out in the Maamar Torah of this week's Parsha, that the number of the Jewish people, so there's the number that can be counted. So there's a number. By definition, if it's a number, it can be counted. But it's a number that you can't count. For instance, the examples given, like sand. Sand, in theory, if you micros count every single grain of sand, so you have a number, but you just don't know what the number is. It's impossible to count. So that's the idea. You mitzvah b'nei Yisrael kachol hayom, like the sand. Asher lo yimod lo yisapar. You can't measure and count it. Hanushu begeder mispar v'schalkus. In theory, there's a number. We come up in lo yisapar. It's not possible to count. Chol hayom shu begeder v'schalkus. The sand is separate. Every single grain of sand is separate from the next one, especially sand versus dirt. Shekol gargir hu nivdol mechaveri. Every grain is separate from its friend, from the other grain of salt. Hugam begeder mispar. And in theory, there is a number. If you were to take a small amount of sand and you put them into a vessel, then you could separate them, each one, and count how many there are. If you can look at this at the beach, you can't say I'm going to count all the grains of salt, the grains of sand at the beach. So what's deeper than that? This difference between if it is sand or if it's a gush offer. A gush offer means to say when there's a little moisture there, he's explaining in a second, you have moisture, so it creates mud. Mud is like a piece of dirt. The piece of dirt, you don't even see the sand. At least you look at the sand, you see the individual grains. It's almost impossible to count. But if you look at dirt, you don't see pieces of dirt. But if you were to totally dry out the dirt of all its moisture, then you would see that it's like sand. That's what sand is. Sand is dried out grains of sand. If you put the moisture, it creates dirt. It creates a gush. So he says, well, any case are deeper. He's negam gush offer. Even if you look at a piece of dirt, there you don't see any kind of separation. Who began this chalkus in theory can be separated from mispar. If you were to take the water out, if you would dry it out, then it would be like sand. It's the water who is chalkus from mispar. It's the water that causes it to be a gush, a single piece of dirt. So that's like the bleak. Seemingly, it looks like bleak. You can't see any separation. But really, there is a separation. It's just the water gives it the appearance that it is a gush, it's one piece of dirt. Like we find that by the angels, it says in the Gemara, there's thousands of thousands, tens of thousands. We know the highest number in Lashon HaKodesh is Rivoy, which is 10,000. Mispar Gedud Echad, of one regiment. So you can't count the angels because there's like pieces of sand. But it's a regiment, so there's a number there. We'll do the mispar, and how many regiments are there is also an accounting. Every regiment is separate from its friend, from the next regiment. Then there's tens of thousands. How many regiments there are? There's no count. So this comes from Sefer, where there's, in theory, there is a number there, but this number itself is not defined. That's the way it is in Sefer. So Sefer seemingly when a person walks into the sand, you can't say, wow, there's thousands of grains of sand here. It looks limitless, but in theory there's a limit, but the limitless is in the appearance. But when you say memalik olam, that's mamish, the way things come b'hagbola mamish. It comes mamish. But we're trying to explain over here, what does it mean, bleak vulnerable? So the bleak vulnerable would be sort of like the sand, which is not really something counted, or even more the idea of a gush offer, which is mamish, like you can't even see that it's separate pieces. But in theory, if you dry it out, you'd see it separate. It's only the moisture that creates the image of a single piece of dirt. So that's all different durim, different levels within Soiviv. So it seems like it's limitless, but in theory, there's a limit. But then you have mamish limited, which is the idea of memalik olam, where Hashem fills the world. That's all the idea of soiviv, which gives off the impression of bligvul, of limitless. But if you look at it the way Hashem comes into filling the world, he's back mamish. That's mamish limited. We're moving Imam Razal, like it says, just like this soul fits the body specifically. So to there's the level of Malik Olam fills the world. Not only that, you could identify the character of every part of the neshama from the body. So if you know that the power to see shows that there's specific power of vision. The power to listen is the power to hear, the power of taste, the power of smell, the power of mobility of the hands, and the walking of the feet. So here you see clearly the definition, the Hagbalah, the limits, and also the power to in your feet. This limit is different than the power in the eyes. You could only walk with your feet. You could only see with your eyes. So that's the idea of Mimal and Soiv. So he says, Atzmus Ein Sof, the essence of God is beyond even what's called the Hagbalah of Mimalik Alamim, the limitations of the way Hashem fills the world, or the way Hashem is Soiviv, which is the Bli Gvul in Gvul, the limitless within the limitations, which is like the idea of the sand, which is seemingly limitless, although in theory there is a limit. But the essence of God is beyond both these levels. Not only the essence of God beyond the way Hashem fills the world, meaning the limitations of vision, so to say, like the idea of the way the Neshama fills the body, where it has very specific functions, which is the same thing to nature, the way God fills the world in a natural way, which seemingly has very specific functionality. So too, even more than that, the essence of God is even greater than the way the Hashem is the limitless seemingly in creation. Like we said before, because at the end of the day, Soviv has its own limitations. Just the limitations gives off the appearance of limitless. But Hashem himself is mamish, the simplicity and the limitless that has no definition, not even definition of limited in a way of sand. How much you were in theory be able to count all the sand of all the beaches of all the world, of the entire world. Because here the Rebbe says something very, very simple. What's the idea of the limitless in the Eibishter? The limitless in the Eibishter is specifically in its achdus. The oneness of Hashem is in itself limitless. It's not one because it's one in a limited number. It has no definition. There's no two, because there's no haschalkus, there's no separation, and there's no separation. It's everything. There's everything and nothing in the same existence. Like he says, Hu Yisbarach Ein Sof, he has no limit. And Achdus Abshut, the absolute oneness. The fact that it's mamish one, not one versus two, Yachid, is Shoyl Ribu, is separate, is counter to any kind of plural. Absolute simplicity has no separation. From if that's the case, God's even greater than Soviv. Means say the essence of God is even beyond the idea of Soviv, where there seems to give this impression of limitless. That's limitless because there's so many numbers. Here the idea is it's limitless because there's absolutely no numbers. It's the absolute. There's no misper. There's absolute pshitus. And pshitus, the essence of pshitus is not because we don't really understand it. Because we're all made up of numbers. We're made up of pieces. We're made up of parts. So we can't really understand what's at the absolute level of pshitus, of simplicity. But in the absolute level of simplicity, there's no schal, there's no separation, there's no numbers before. Everything's one. Everything's the Eibishter. There's nothing else. That's etzim. That's the Atzmus. This says, that's the idea. We can't think. Our thinking is not God's thinking, because our thinking is at any way, and at the highest level, it's structured in parts. You need to do what? When we talk about speech and thought, we know the creations from the world of the hidden worlds were created from thought, just like a thought is hidden. So too, it creates hiddenness, which is things in the world of hiddenness, of iskasi, things that are covered. Like we said before, that's the idea of soivid, which is limitless, but it's limitless within creation. That's what it means to say that my thought, you think, and when you have a thought that's a hidden thought, similar as God's thought, he says, no, my thought's not like your thoughts. Because God's is beyond even the thought, which seemingly is part of the essence, even beyond the Seif of Kalamim, which is creation of the world of hiddenness, which is like a thought, but nevertheless, God's beyond the thought. A person has a thought, and that thought captures what you're thinking. Because Because, for instance, when you think about something, and your mind is preoccupied with a thought. The Indian, for instance, gives an example. If you're thinking about the law, in Bab Mitzvah, what's the law? If two people holding a talis, how do you divide it? How do you deal with an issue with it? Two people saying, both of them claiming ownership. So you're thinking about that concept, and you can't simultaneously think a second thought. Your thought is your attention is captured by the thought. And you can't have an attention simultaneously with a totally different thought about what would be the law if you're exchanging a cow and a donkey. And the more the detailed you focus, the more you're separate from the second thought. God's not captured by the thought. He could be creating with the thought, but the thought doesn't capture him. Hashem's attention is not captured by the thought. Because he's limitless. Because if you're saying that Hashem's thought his attention is captured by the thought, means that there's a definition. You're defining Hashem. Now he's focused on this thought. He can't be focused on something else. That's not how Hashem operates. Hashem is beyond any kind of capture. You can't be toifus Hashem. Hashem is himself not being nitfas even in the thought itself. Because the thought has nothing to do with the essence of thought. He can't be focused. He can't be captured by his attention, so to say, in a specific thought. So even though Hashem's machshav is obviously deeper than our machshav, so the concept of machshav is something spiritual. But he says, nevertheless, there's another way of explaining that my thoughts are not like your thoughts. That means your thought is so limited, God's thought is so much deeper than our thought. So to say that the thought is closer in a way, has more of a spirit of the essence than, so to say, the speech of God or the action of God. And then where does it show is that you can't create something with thought. You could think a whole day about something. It's not going to change the facts. It could motivate you to do something that will change the facts. It can motivate you to say something that you didn't say something, but you can't create anything by thought. You can't even do anything by thought. All you do is think about how you're going to do something. But the actual thought itself won't create anything. You can't move something by thought. Not understanding with all the great magicians that are able to move with their mind people, but it's not the same idea. It says a person could only do things through speech or action. Although what you're doing is only going to be yesh, something from something, you still can't create something from nothing, even with your action or your speech. Because the idea of creating something from nothing, only God could do. You can't do something from something. For instance, to take gold and to turn it into a product, or to dictate that someone should do something because you say something, that's all, at least, but there's a change, something's happening, there's an effect. God, the king says, and so too, it gets moved. The ruling of the king gives it a law, and everyone has to act on it. If the king is thinking, so you could try to guess what the king is thinking, but the king doesn't dictate what he has to say, so how are you supposed to know what the king is thinking? You can think, maybe you could get ahead of the game to try to think this is what he may be thinking, he may think, but until he tells you what to do, you don't know. That's not by God. God creates with his thought. Like it says, the souls of the soul of the Yid comes from Machshava. And there's the world of the hidden world that comes from the world of Machshava. God's thought creates. Doesn't need to be in the idea of speech or action. With one thought, the whole world was created. Because Hashem is one with his thoughts, and therefore, just like he creates, so too his thoughts can create. Just like God can create something from nothing. He says, although we see clearly, like there's a certain closeness to the essence from the thought, just like a thought of a person is close, so to say, means to say that God's thoughts are greater than ours because we can't create anything with thoughts, but God can. So we see there's something more godly in the thoughts, so to say, of God than versus the speech of God. Nevertheless, he's not captured by his thoughts. It's still as deep as the thoughts are, as connected the thoughts are to Hashem's essence. It doesn't capture God. God's not limited by the focus of a thought. I love cloud. It has nothing to do. It's not even comparable to the essence of God. Even the way Hashem is encompassing energy is nothing to do with the essence of God. And we see what this is all about. Now let's do a few. Let's see if we could do. Maybe we could do one or two more paragraphs here. Actually, we'll just do Dalet, the first paragraph of Dalet, then next class we'll continue with the next piece. Now, so now that we established the fact that even though Hashem encompasses the world, is the unbelievable, the limitless and limited, is nothing comparable to the essence of God. So how do we bring it down? How do we bring down the essence of God if it's so far-fetched? It's so out of the essence. It's not even comparable to the mimal where Hashem fills or encompasses the world. So how are we mamshech the essence? Hashem's essence is through, means everything of Olam is the highest way of Hashem's performance within the world, whether it's miracles, whether it's believable, whether it's limitless, limited. That's all within sight of. How do we get to the essence? Where's the essence of God? How do you mamshech the essence of Hashem through avodah of the Shamis Yisrael and the Kiyum Torah mitzvahs? Means there's two conditions. One is Torah mitzvahs. The second is that who does the Torah mitzvahs not in the Shamis Yisrael. If a guy puts on, if a Anochi puts on tefillin, it's not mamshech anything. When a Yid does the mitzvahs according to the Hagbalas, the way Hashem says that during the hours of such and such, it's zman tefillah, it's zman tefillin, then you're mamshech damshach. So Hashem dictated how it goes through Torah mitzvahs. It says that you make Hashem through Torah mitzvahs. By doing Torah mitzvahs, you're touching, you're making, so to say, the essence of Hashem within the creation. Behind explains when he does Torah mitzvahs, which is the Ramach, Shem Keneged, Ramach Evan Demalka, Naseh Binin Ramach Evan Demalka. The mitzvahs themselves, each mitzvah corresponds to another limb of the king. You're making the limbs of the king by doing the mitzvahs, because you're creating the mitzvah. In the mitzvahs is coded in the mitzvahs is the essence of Hashem. Bechinas Kamara and Batam. Where does everything start? From the brain, and the Jewish people are there in the brain, therefore they're creating everything, as will be explained in details in the next sif. We have, I think this is so we have a few we could do. I think we could fit this all into one or two more classes. We'll see how it goes. Okay, thank you very much for joining. If we don't have a class tomorrow, then on Shabbos, and we'll continue after Shabbos.